47 years old, standing in his own living room in Tennessee, Wes Hampton looked at his children and said the words he had been carrying for longer than any of them realized. The camera was already rolling. Nobody in that room had rehearsed what came next, and you can tell by watching it that nobody expected the faces those kids made when the meaning landed. For a man whose name has sat beside the Gaither Vocal Band for nearly 20 years, whose baritone shaped what millions of believers heard on Sunday afternoons, this was not the kind of announcement anyone in gospel music saw coming. And the reason it hit so hard has almost nothing to do with music. Stay with this one, because there is something around the 10-minute mark that connects Wes's choice to a pattern inside the Gaither world that people in the industry have discussed privately for years and rarely say out loud. Once you see it, the whole thing reads differently. Wes joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, walking into one of the most beloved institutions Southern gospel has ever produced. Bill Gaither had spent decades building something that stopped being a singing group a long time before Wes arrived. The vocal band was a ministry, a living testimony, a soundtrack for American believers who grew up with those homecoming videos playing in the living room while dinner cooked. Earning a seat alongside David Phelps, Guy Penrod, and Mark Lowry was not a small line on a resume. It was the moment his career arrived, and he delivered on it in ways even his most hopeful supporters had not counted on. His voice carried warmth and gravity at the same time, which is rarer than people assume. A baritone with enough depth to anchor a room and enough gentleness to hold a lyric without crushing it. Listen to those early recordings and you can hear the group finding a new center of balance with him in the blend. Fans picked up on something honest almost immediately. Not a performer executing a role, but a man singing from a place deeper than technique. For the millions who came up with the Homecoming series through the 90s and into the new century, he became part of the fabric of their faith life. Not another talented voice cycling through a famous lineup. He was Wes, the one whose presence on that stage felt permanent, something you could count on season after season, recording after recording. Life away from the lights looked equally settled. He and his wife Leanne built their home in Tennessee and raised their children inside the same Christian faith that had shaped his own childhood, the same faith that gave his performances their particular conviction. While other artists of his generation chased television exposure and crossover appeal, he kept pointing away from himself and toward the songs and what those songs carried. That quiet faithfulness, that willingness to serve the music rather than be served by it, is exactly why what came next caught so many people off guard. By the early 2020s, his public presence had shifted, and anyone paying attention could feel it without being able to name it. His posts carried different weight, less about schedules and stage nights, more about mornings with his kids and the specific rhythms of a man choosing to be present in his own house. Comments started surfacing underneath, people saying he seemed different somehow, more at peace than ever, and also more serious about something they could not identify. What those pictures were reflecting was a conversation happening inside the Hampton home, one he and Leanne had been sitting in for a long time. A conversation about calling and about what faithfulness actually demands when two versions of it pull a man in opposite directions at once. The Gaither Vocal Band, by its nature, requires an enormous amount of time away from home. Recording schedules, concert tours, homecoming tapings, these are not side commitments. They are the core of what the group does, and they shape the life of every artist who carries them. For nearly 2 decades, he managed that reality with a steadiness people admired. But something was turning in him, moving in a direction he could not fix with discipline or a better calendar. Bill Gaither himself has spoken more than once about the specific tension living inside a gospel artist's life, the pull between serving the wider church and serving the family God placed directly in your care. It never resolves cleanly. No formula makes both work without cost. A man eventually reaches a point where he has to name what he believes God is asking of him, then live with the answer. Wes reached that point, and when he did not process it privately or send it out through a press release. He brought it to the people it would cost the most, his children, sitting them down, telling them he was stepping away from the Gaither Vocal Band, not because something had broken, no conflict, no failure, none of the harder stories that sometimes trail announcements like this into public view. The decision came from somewhere else entirely. A conviction built slowly and prayerfully over years that the most important ministry left in his life was the one happening inside his own house. His children did not respond the way a scripted moment would have looked. Children rarely do. What the camera caught was more layered than simple happiness or simple sadness. Young people realizing in real time that their father was making a sacrifice on their behalf, that he was naming them as the priority out loud in a moment that could not be walked back. That lands differently than a birthday card or a promise made in passing. It lands the way things land when they are true. Leanne later confirmed what people close to the family had already worked out. The decision was built through prayer, through honest conversation between husband and wife, and through a growing clarity that God was redirecting his steps toward something more personal than any platform could offer. Nothing about it was impulsive. In many ways, it was the most deliberate thing he had done in years. The response from inside the gospel community carried the warmth you would expect from people who recognize real sacrifice when they see it. Bill Gaither, who has watched more gifted artists reach this same crossroads than almost anyone alive in Christian music, expressed respect and love for the choice. Coming from the man who built the very thing being walked away from, that is not a small gesture. It says something about what the Gaither family represents, that a departure from the right place gets honored instead of mourned. David Phelps, who carries his own history of stepping away before eventually coming back, has spoken about the weight of that kind of decision, about how completely a man's identity can wrap itself around a group like that, and how much faith it takes to trust that something equally meaningful waits on the other side of leaving. His words carried the credibility of someone who had stood at the same door. What opened for Wes on the other side was a solo ministry, built around the same faith and the same voice that had made him a recognizable presence in worship music and Southern gospel for 20 years, but shaped now by a freedom he had not known since before 2005. He could choose where to go, when to be home, which songs to carry into a room, and what to say from a platform once the music stopped. Running through all of it was the ability to bring his family alongside him, to let his children watch from the inside what it looks like when a man follows what he believes God is asking, even when the asking costs him something visible. That is the announcement those kids heard. That is what was on the camera. And even described secondhand, it carries a weight that resists clean explanation, because it belongs to that rare category of moment when a public figure stops performing his faith and simply lives it in front of the people who most needed to see it done. For anyone who followed his journey across the years, through the early homecoming recordings, the live tapings, all those Sunday afternoons when that voice came through a television or a stereo and landed exactly where it needed to, this reads nothing like a standard career update. We watched him stand on that stage, shoulder to shoulder, with some of the greatest voices in Christian music history. We heard that baritones settle into harmonies that seemed to hold the room together by their own weight. Across dozens of Gaither productions, we saw a man giving his gift with evident and unhurried joy. What we are seeing now is a different kind of giving, one with no applause and no cameras aimed at a stage, only the quieter weight of a father deciding his children's story of faith would include the memory of a man who chose to be there on purpose, at cost. What this says about gospel music more broadly is worth sitting with. Southern gospel has always celebrated the voice, the stage, the recording, and those things matter. But the artists who carry real authority when they sing about surrender and trust and peace that passes understanding are almost always the ones whose lives away from the microphone tell the same story as their lyrics. He has always seemed like one of those people, and this decision proves it in a way no performance could. If you were among the fans who felt something shift in that group's sound when his voice joined the lineup and understood, without being told, that something valuable had arrived, then you already know what is meant by the idea that his singing was never only about music. It was about the life behind the message and the willingness to live that life with integrity when nobody was recording. Watching him choose his family at the exact moment when so many men in his position would have chosen otherwise speaks to that integrity as clearly as any note he has sung. Here is the part most people have not connected yet, and it matters because it places his decision inside a longer and more honest history. The Gaither Vocal Band has seen a number of gifted artists arrive at this same crossroads across the decades, and what each of them chose tells its own piece of the story. Michael English departed in 1994 under circumstances far more painful than anything Wes has faced, and the years that followed carried their own very public weight. Russ Taff stepped away to deal with struggles he has since addressed with remarkable honesty in his own documentary, a level of courage the gospel community has taken decades to fully appreciate. Guy Penrod, whose baritone anchored that group for years beside David Phelps, stepped away in 2008 to raise 8 children, a decision that surprised plenty of people at the time and has since come to be understood as one of the most consistent choices any artist in that circle ever made. Consistent, that is, with everything he had spent years singing about. That pattern means something. It tells us what the Gaither Vocal Band asks of the men who carry it, and it tells us what kind of men are drawn to it in the first place. Almost without exception, men shaped by deep faith and family conviction. And that same depth is what eventually calls some of them off the road and back toward something quieter and closer to home. Bill Gaither has always seemed to hold this without resentment. He has spoken across the years about building something designed to outlast any single voice or any single season. The homecoming movement he and Gloria created is not one lineup. It is a family of artists whose stories intersect and diverge and sometimes circle back in ways nobody planned. Wes Hampton is one chapter in a very long book, and that chapter has not ended. It has turned a page in a direction that makes more sense the longer you look at the man who wrote it. Since stepping back, he has kept performing in solo settings, bringing that same presence and that same voice to audiences who love him, now with a schedule shaped in part by his family rather than around them. The worship music he carries into those rooms holds more weight than it did before, because the man singing it has paid for something, and the people listening can hear that cost sitting underneath the melody. What he is building in this season is still taking shape, and that is, in its own way, exactly the kind of story people who love gospel music have always been drawn to. Not the finished monument, but the man still walking, still choosing, still trusting that the road ahead goes somewhere worth going. What happens next for him and his family is something the gospel community will be watching, even if the watching stays quieter than his homecoming years ever were. One question sits open and unresolved, which is what place he will occupy in the longer memory of Southern gospel and Christian music. His voice has not diminished. His faith, by every visible sign, has not wavered. His family is intact, and by all accounts stronger for what he chose. But the shape of his legacy is still being written, one concert and one decision at a time. That is no small thing for an artist who has given as much of himself as he has across 2 decades of public ministry. Whatever comes, the fans who have followed this ministry across the years know one thing for certain. His story is not finished. The man who spent nearly 20 years giving his voice to songs about faith, hope, and the faithfulness of God is now living those same themes in a quieter register, in rooms that hold fewer people but matter every bit as much. If gospel music has taught us anything across all those homecoming tapings and concert nights and recordings made in the belief that the right song reaching the right person at the right moment can change everything, it has taught us that the quiet chapters are sometimes where the deepest things happen. If this story moved you, stay close, because we have been covering the longer history of the Gaither Vocal Band and the transitions that shaped it across the decades. Some of what has come out of those stories is just as layered and just as unexpected as what we shared here today.